I never planned for anything to shift, not in the way it eventually did. It started quietly, like most dangerous things do. My relationship at home had become a routine I could walk through with my eyes closed. My husband spoke to me in clipped sentences, his attention scattered, his presence more like background noise. We weren't fighting, we had simply drifted. The distance was subtle but constant, like a draft no one bothers to fix because you learn to live with the chill. He came into the picture without intention. A relative who stayed over temporarily, someone young but composed, observant in a way people rarely are anymore. At first, he was simply polite, always offering help, always noticing when I looked tired or overwhelmed. Anyone else might have dismissed it as kindness, but I felt something different in the way he watched me. Not lust, not disrespect, just awareness, sharp, attentive, and oddly comforting. I hadn't been looked at like that in years. It started with small moments. I'd walk into the room and feel his eyes lift before he even turned his head. He'd pause mid-task just to acknowledge me with a slight nod, as if telling me silently that he saw me. Really saw me. The kind of attention that sinks into your thoughts when you least expect it. I found myself lingering around him longer than necessary. Not to talk, just to feel present in someone's line of vision again. One afternoon, while we were alone in the living room, he made a comment so simple yet disarming. He said he liked watching how people move because it told him who they were more honestly than their words. I laughed it off at first, but the way he said it, steady, casual, without any hidden tone, made something inside me tense. I asked him what he meant, and he turned to me with that calm, unreadable expression he always wore. He said I carried myself like someone who used to be confident, but was now trying to hide how tired she felt. It was unsettling how accurate he was. That I felt exposed, not in a physical sense but emotionally. Like he was reading a diary I had never written but had lived every day. I should have stepped away. I should have shut down the conversation, drawn a boundary, reminded myself of who I was and what I had. But instead, I found myself wanting to hear more, wanting to know what else he saw. That's when guilt first flickered, thin but present. Not enough to stop me, just enough to remind me that there was a line I hadn't crossed yet but could. I told myself it was harmless, that being noticed wasn't a betrayal. Yet deep down I sensed the danger. It wasn't his gaze that threatened my marriage. It was how willingly I accepted it. By the end of that day, I caught myself waiting for the next moment he'd look at me. And that was the first sign that something inside me had already shifted, quietly, irreversibly. After that day, something wordless settled between us. We didn't talk about it, didn't acknowledge the shift, but it shaped every interaction like a quiet current pulling us in the same direction. He didn't change his behavior dramatically. He was still polite, still reserved, but there was a new intention in the way he glanced at me. An intention I didn't reject. If anything, I had started to anticipate it, as if his attention filled the spaces my husband had long abandoned. Our conversations grew slower, more deliberate. He would ask about my day, but not casually. He listened with a patience I wasn't used to, as though every detail mattered. And when I spoke, he watched the way I reacted to my own words, reading me with that same unsettling accuracy. It was flattering in a way I couldn't admit out loud. It felt dangerous because it was entirely emotional, and that made it heavier than anything physical ever could. There were moments I began to notice myself adjusting unconsciously. If he was in the kitchen, I found a reason to walk through it. If he sat in the living room, I took a few extra seconds arranging something nearby. I wasn't performing, I was simply allowing myself to be visible again. Every time I sensed his gaze quietly follow me, a strange mix of comfort and guilt rose in my chest. I told myself it didn't mean anything, but I knew that was a lie I was using as a shield. He never crossed a line with words. Not once. That was what made it more intoxicating. His restraint gave me room to imagine what he wasn't saying, and those silences were louder than any confession could be. He'd study my face in those moments when he thought I wasn't paying attention. And when our eyes met unexpectedly, neither of us looked away quickly anymore. It wasn't boldness. It was understanding. One evening, we were both in the hallway, passing each other. My husband was in another room, unaware, uninterested as usual. Our shoulders brushed lightly. A small accidental touch that shouldn't have meant anything. But we both paused for a moment too long after it happened. Not speaking. Not moving. just absorbing the fact that even proximity now carried weight. Later that night, he approached me with an honesty that startled me. He said he noticed things about people not because he was curious, but because it made him feel connected to them. Then, almost hesitantly, he admitted that he understood me more by watching my silences than my words. Something about the way he said it made my breath catch, not romantically but vulnerably. He was offering a truth without asking for one back, that I didn't respond. Not because I didn't have anything to say, but because saying anything would have made the moment real, defined, irreversible. Instead, I let the silence speak, and he understood my acceptance without needing confirmation. That night, I realized the line wasn't ahead of us anymore. We had already crossed it quietly, through glances, pauses, and unspoken permissions neither of us tried to deny. The days that followed felt different, as if the air itself had thickened between us. Nothing dramatic happened, yet every moment carried a quiet charge I couldn't ignore anymore. I found myself alert to his presence even before he entered a room, as though my body recognized his attention before my mind admitted it. Whenever he watched me, it wasn't bold or demanding. It was steady, patient, almost reverent. An attention I didn't earn through words but through simply existing in his line of sight. And somehow that felt more intimate than anything else. I began noticing how much I relied on it. I would catch myself checking the doorway, wondering if he'd pass by. When he did, there was always the smallest pause, the briefest acknowledgement that only I seemed to detect. My husband never noticed. He rarely looked up long enough to catch anything. The contrast between being ignored and being seen sharpened every emotion, until I couldn't pretend it was harmless anymore. One night, long after everyone had gone quiet, I stepped into the living room to switch off a forgotten lamp. He was there, sitting with a book on his lap, though it was obvious he hadn't been reading. He looked up the moment I entered, and instead of the usual polite nod, he held my gaze with a seriousness I wasn't prepared for. It wasn't desire. It was something heavier, something that felt like confession without words. I should have turned off the light and walked away. Instead, I hesitated, letting the silence settle around us. He closed the book slowly, almost cautiously, as if trying not to startle the moment we were both suspended in. Then, in a voice that was barely above a whisper, he said he didn't know how to stop noticing me. There was no accusation in his tone, no expectation, just an honest admission he had been carrying alone. My heart tightened, not from shock but recognition. I wasn't innocent in this. I wasn't passive. I had allowed every glance, every pause, every silent conversation that never needed language. I felt a wave of guilt rise and fall, but it didn't wash him away. Instead, it made me painfully aware of my own choices, how willingly I had stepped into this dangerous closeness. When I didn't respond, he didn't repeat himself. He just waited, watching my reaction with the kind of patience that made me feel exposed. Words felt too heavy to speak, so I offered the only truth I could manage. I didn't move away. I stayed exactly where I was, letting the space between us shrink just enough to reveal what neither of us had dared to say openly. He understood. That understanding was the moment we crossed the real boundary. Not with touch but with intention. We didn't come closer. Yet somehow we were closer than we had ever been. No promises were made, no lines spoken aloud, but everything between us shifted. The silence felt like a choice, one we had both accepted. In that quiet, I realized we had stepped into a place where nothing was innocent anymore. And once you enter that place, there is no returning to who you were before. The days after that night carried a kind of stillness that felt both comforting and unsettling. Nothing had happened in the way people usually define infidelity, yet everything within me felt altered. I moved through the house aware of an invisible thread tying us together, one woven from glances and unspoken choices. I couldn't look at him without remembering how neither of us stepped back. And I couldn't look at my husband without feeling the weight of everything I hadn't said, everything I had allowed to grow in silence. My husband didn't notice the change, or maybe he didn't want to. He was wrapped in his routine, absorbed in work, uninterested in the parts of me that had quietly started drifting away. He sensed something though, an unfamiliar distance in the way I responded, a softness missing from my tone. Instead of asking, he chose to ignore it, the same way he ignored so many small cracks over the years. That ignorance was its own kind of answer. He, on the other hand, became more careful. He didn't linger as much, didn't allow his gaze to rest too long when others were around. But when we crossed paths alone, the air still shifted. His restraint didn't erase the connection. It only made it clearer. He wasn't pushing boundaries anymore. He was waiting respectfully, quietly, for me to decide what this meant. That patience made everything harder, not easier. One afternoon, we found ourselves alone again, not by design but by timing. He stood across the room, hands folded, expression steady but unreadable. For the first time, he spoke directly about the weight of what we were carrying. He said he didn't want to be the reason I felt torn, and that if stepping back was what I needed, he would do it without hesitation. His voice didn't tremble, but I heard the strain beneath it. It wasn't a plea. It was acceptance that I didn't know how to respond. Part of me wanted the tension to end, to close this chapter and walk back into the life I used to understand. Another part of me, the part that had woken up under his gaze, felt alive in a way I hadn't in years. Not because of romance, but because being seen changes something in you. It makes you aware of everything you've settled for. I told him I didn't regret anything, even if I couldn't explain what anything meant. He nodded, almost relieved, almost sad, as if he understood more than my words revealed. We agreed without saying it that we would carry this quietly, without pushing it into a place it didn't belong. Some connections aren't meant to be acted on. They're meant to be remembered as days passed. He kept his distance in a way that protected us both, but the understanding remained. When he finally left the house weeks later, he paused before stepping out. No confession, no dramatic goodbye, just a look that said he would carry those moments with him. And I knew I would too. Infidelity doesn't always come wrapped in touch or confession. Sometimes it arrives quietly, in the way someone looks at you, listens to you, understands you. And sometimes the deepest betrayal isn't something you do. It's something you feel, and choose not to stop.